Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really intense, sweeping analysis. We're objectively unpacking Chapter 17 of our source text, which is actually the first of 3 closing chapters for the final part of the book. So essentially, the author is using this section as a closing statement to summarize the overarching ideas they've presented throughout the entire work. We are going to strictly look at how the text frames the feminist movement as a cultural wedge. Our goal here is simply to map out the author's arguments, dissecting the claims and the ideological framework presented in the text. Let's get right into it.
All right, let's take a quick look at the roadmap for today's explainer. First up, the historical anchor. Second, the feminist tsunami. Third, the victimhood trap. Fourth, equal opportunity versus outcomes. And finally, the final verdict.
Starting with Part 1, the historical anchor, focusing on cooperation, sacrifice, and the nuclear family.
So the author kicks things off by establishing what they consider to be an objective, historical baseline of cooperation between the sexes, long before any modern ideological shifts took place. According to the text, this biblical foundation from Genesis represents thousands of years where men and women literally subdued the earth together. The author argues that throughout history, the sexes found their strength not in division, but in the rock-solid foundation of the nuclear family. Now, they do acknowledge that yes, some men definitely abuse their power, but the text asserts that the overarching historical narrative is actually one of joint effort, surviving wars, surviving famine, all through mutual reliance.
Building on that idea of historical cooperation, the book points out that historical institutions frequently required immense sacrifice and protection from men, rather than just merely oppressing women. The author points to things like the medieval chivalric code, which explicitly required knights to defend vulnerable women. They highlight European dower rights, which were specifically designed to financially protect widows. And perhaps most significantly, the text points to the conscription of men during World Wars I and II. You know, men being sent to the front lines with the explicit duty of sacrificing their lives to protect their families back home. The author argues that modern narratives deliberately ignore these historical protections.
Moving right along to Part 2, the feminist tsunami, subtitled The Ideological Drift and the Genealogy of Ideas.
Here's where we get into what the author calls the drift, basically the slow erosion of those foundational ideas driven by a tsunami of new thought. This ideological transition is marked by rhetoric from early feminist leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. By 1895, the author notes Stanton and her contemporaries really began to reframe foundational institutions, like the Church and the Bible, as inherently oppressive tools designed for the domination of women, rather than institutions that historically elevated them.
And you can really see this ideological shift in the words of early thinkers like Sarah Grimke. The author argues that this is where feminism began replacing a narrative of historical cooperation with one of perpetual victimhood and subjugation. The text posits that these early thinkers ignored the sacrifices men made for women and instead chose to paint all men with a broad brush as evil oppressors and women as eternal slaves.
And that brings us to the absolute core concept of this chapter. The author defines the wedge as a cultural and ideological division deliberately driven between the sexes. The text explicitly links this shift to the ideas of Charles Fourier, who actually coined the term feminism, and Karl Marx. According to the book's framework, just as Marx sought to divide the rich and the poor into warring classes, feminism took that exact same ideological bait and categorized men and women as warring political classes, the oppressors and the oppressed.
If we map out the author's genealogy of ideas, we can track the evolution of the movement across 4 distinct waves. We go from the first wave, focusing on suffrage, to the second wave's workplace and reproductive focus, then the third wave's intersectionality, all the way up to the fourth wave's social media activism. The author's key argument here is that with each passing wave, the movement claimed entirely new dimensions of oppression, driving the wedge deeper and deeper and demanding new waves of societal disruption.
Which brings us to Part 3. The victimhood trap, or the illusion of freedom in avoiding fault.
To explain how this whole ideology actually takes hold, the author relies heavily on a psychological trap, illustrated through a really powerful parable about a man in a wheelchair. So in the story, a young man suffers a temporary injury and receives this massive outpouring of sympathy from his friends. But soon, he becomes addicted to that attention. Even when his body physically heals, he pretends to still be injured because he's terrified of losing his newfound status as a victim. Eventually, his friends leave, and when he finally tries to stand on his own, he finds his legs have actually atrophied. The crucial takeaway in this parable is the author's assertion that relying on the sympathy of a victim status, which they argue is a core mechanism of feminism, eventually causes true strength, independence, and genuine human connection to completely atrophy.
All right, part 4. Equal opportunity versus outcomes, looking at what the author calls the shipwreck of the modern workplace.
Now we're getting into the impact phase of the book's argument, objectively exploring how the text claims these ideas manifest in modern society today. The text posits a really critical distinction here, arguing that treating people fairly is entirely different from the forced equality of outcomes demanded by what they term Marxist feminism. Fairness, the author argues, acknowledges biological realities and merit. On the flip side, equality of outcome demands exact identical representation across all fields, which the text suggests often requires forcibly prioritizing gender over actual, tangible qualifications.
To illustrate this, the author pulls in a statistic popularized by clinical psychologist Jordan B. Peterson, highlighting that demands for equal representation rarely ever extend to the bottom of the societal ladder. For instance, nearly 99% of bricklayers are men. The author uses this specific data point to argue that feminists do not actually want equal representation in physically demanding, hazardous, or undesirable jobs, but instead, they only demand quotas for positions of high authority and comfort.
And speaking of hazardous jobs, look at this. The author uses workplace fatality data to really push back against the prevailing narrative. With over 90% of workplace fatalities occurring among men, the text argues that men predominantly work in dangerous professions that carry way higher risk. Think logging, mining, firefighting. The author claims this data directly counters the argument that all societal disparities stem from systemic discrimination against women, highlighting instead the inherent physical dangers men historically and currently take on.
The author goes even further by reevaluating some very common statistics you've probably heard before regarding violence and the wage gap. The text argues that broader contexts are deliberately ignored to maintain a narrative of female oppression. For example, while fully acknowledging the realities of sexual assault, the author points out that men actually make up 76% of homicide victims. They also cite studies showing men are victims in nearly 40% of domestic abuse incidents, but face massive reporting stigmas. Finally, they argue the much-talked-about 84% wage gap drastically shrinks down to under 7% when you adjust for actual hours worked, occupation choices, and the inherent danger of the jobs taken, choices they argue are rooted in biological preferences rather than systemic sexism.
Finally, we reach part 5, the final verdict, ideology versus accountability.
So, here we are at the author's completely unvarnished closing verdict on the ideological core of the feminist movement. This essentially wraps up the overarching arguments made throughout the entire book. Now, while explicitly acknowledging that women have faced real historical injustices and that some early feminists absolutely operated from honest convictions, the book ultimately concludes that the movement's core ideology is destructive. The author asserts that this ideology demands status based on a hierarchy of victimhood rather than actual merit, that it despises personal accountability, actively opposes the nuclear family, and fundamentally relies on falsely painting men as villains and women as helpless victims.
And the author leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question. Did this movement seek true equality, or was it supremacy? It's a striking thought that really challenges the reader to evaluate the ultimate trajectory of this movement based on the evidence presented in the text. As we wrap up this explainer, this forces us to consider what true fairness actually looks like in practice, and whether the cultural wedge driven between the sexes can ever truly be repaired. So, based on the frameworks we've objectively explored today, how would you answer that?